All right. Okay. Welcome, everybody. I imagine everybody knows who I am, but in case you do not, I'm Martin Horak. I'm the director of the local government program here in political science, and I'd like to welcome everybody to a new season of the Local Governance Seminar Series. This is our first seminar, and we will be having about 6 of these probably between now and next April or May, so stay tuned for future seminars. I'll tell you a little bit about that at the end of today's talk. But I'm very happy today to introduce our first speaker for this year's series. This is Professor Zack Taylor. And Professor Taylor is actually just joining us here in the Department of Political Science as assistant professor. But he's spent 3 years already before that as assistant professor in city studies at the University of Toronto Scarborough. He completed his PhD at the University of Toronto as well in political science, and before that he worked for some years as a professional planner. I hope I'm going to characterize your research interests correctly, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. Zack has a diverse set of research interests that include regional governance, regional planning and development, especially from a historical and comparative perspective. He's done a lot of work on municipal elections in Toronto, on regional governance in the GTA, and he's published on several of these subjects. But today he's going to be talking about an ongoing research project, collaborative research project, about resilience and regional and local resilience and thinking about resilience. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody. Part of being brand new, and truly brand new, I've only been in London for less than 3 weeks, I think, is that I'm still getting my feet on the ground. So, and I'm really pleased to start meeting the students who are in the MPA program and others. I guess one of the things that happens when you're brand new is you get put up to do things. So this being one of those things, leading off a seminar series. I have chosen to talk to you today about a project that started about a year ago. I was still at U of T then. At that time, I was also affiliated with the graduate urban planning program there. And one of the buzzwords that you hear a lot about in urban stuff, especially in urban planning, is this idea of resilience. It just seemed to come out of nowhere in the last few years, this idea that somehow the goal of our policymaking should be to increase resilience, whatever that is. This word really is everywhere. We see it from the United Nations, we see it from the World Bank, we see the Brookings Institution talk about resilience, ICLEI talking about resilience. The Rockefeller Foundation has funded a multi-million-dollar project on urban resilience. So what does this mean? Why should we, is it useful? What does it actually mean for policymakers on the ground? This is something that I found interesting to probe. Some have called it the new sustainability, right? It's a word that means everything and yet perhaps nothing. So I think, if it is going to mean something useful to actual real policymakers, we need to figure out what it could mean and assess whether it's actually helpful or whether we can do just fine without it. If it's just a new word or rhetorical cover for doing what we were doing anyway, then why do we need it? Is it just a sales tool? So this was part of what motivated this project. I partnered with the Urban Land Institute's Toronto chapter and applied for a grant from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. They were very generous and helped funded a series of practitioner workshops, the outcome of which I'm not really going to talk about in today's presentation. But the end game of all this is going to be a discussion paper that will be published by the Urban Land Institute this fall, I hope. Though getting this job and moving here has set all of these things back considerably. Okay, So let's look at the origins of the resilience concept. Well, structural engineers see resilience as an intrinsic property of materials, right? So a steel I-beam, for example, could be characterized as resilient if it can take a load, if it can take a stress, and then bounce back to its original shape. So this idea of bouncing back to the way you were before. Biologists view ecosystems as resilient in a somewhat different way. They view ecosystems as being complexly interdependent, of being multivariate systems with a lot going on inside them, always in a state of flux. There is no equilibrium, really. Everything is always in motion, but in aggregate, an ecosystem performs a function. It does something. It offers, it provides particular services. So in biological terms, resilience is the capacity of a complex dynamic system to absorb a shock and but maintain its essential nature, or maintain the functions that it performs. Now, since the 1970s, we also see resilience talked about in psychology, in looking at individuals in their communities, so in social psychology, to try to find out what the individual characteristics and the and the characteristics of the context, social context of an individual that promote recovery from a trauma. So again, there's the use of this word to try to capture something to do with a shock or a challenge or a crisis and recovery from it. Now, in these applications, we can detect two kinds of resilience, right? The engineer is interested in a univariate system, right? The steel I-beam or the bridge that is going along just fine. It's subjected to a shock, it's deformed in some way, and then bounces back to its equilibrium state. So this is a univariate model. It's an equilibrium model. Now, the biologists and the psychologists, as I said, are interested in dynamic systems. So instead of bouncing back, there's this idea of the system perhaps bouncing forward through crisis, through having some sort of positive transformation occur. So, if we think of a system made up of multiple parts, a shock occurs, some of them may go down, some of them may increase in whatever the variable of output is over time. So the idea that the overall system actually increases its output, or is in a more favorable state at the end of it. Now, it may be that some components will actually do better as a result of the disturbance and go down by the end of it. What matters is that there's a whole bunch of things going on at once, and there's kind of a net positive outcome as a result of all of this. So this contrast between bouncing back and kind of bouncing forward, or positive transformation, is something that I think is a useful distinction, but also muddies how we can think about resilience and how we can apply resilience. What does it mean? What should it mean? Now, the notion of urban resilience is really a fairly new idea. We only really started to see this word really since the turn of the millennium. I don't know if any of you I have a hobby, which is doing Google Ngram things. If you ever go to the Ngram viewer, what it does is it looks in the entire database of the 5 million books in Google Books, in the Google Books repository, and you search for a word or a phrase, and it tells you over time it's the frequency of its occurrence. It can be kind of an interesting measure of discourse, what we're talking about. So you see that urban resilience from 1950 to 2000, I mean, it didn't even really appear until the 1980s. And look at this, about 2001, boom, suddenly everybody's talking about urban resilience. It just came out of nowhere. Now, from looking around, I think that the resilience concept has found its way into urban policy discussions from at least 3 directions. The first, which I think we can trace to the Hurricane Katrina disaster, is an interest in natural disaster preparedness and recovery. So the objective of policymakers in cities around the world that are known to be vulnerable to things like earthquakes or tsunamis or hurricanes and cyclones, right, is to develop an efficient response to disaster and a rapid return to pre-disaster conditions. Large-scale natural disasters do all kinds of bad things, right? They destroy and disable hard infrastructure, water systems, sewer systems, electricity systems, transportation systems, and so on. They knock out communication grids, which makes it hard to mount an effective response in the moment. They displace and harm residents directly. They disrupt commerce, so the private sector collapses. All of these impacts undermine the ability of governments to respond, even if they know that there's a high probability that it's going to happen one of these days. So what we see is that the agencies like the World Bank, ICLEI, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, they've all framed urban natural disaster preparedness in recent years as a resilience problem. That's something where we need to encourage resilience, and they've developed grids and checklists and various ways of trying to measure resilience in the sense of bouncing back. Now, some scholars have branched out from natural disasters to look at the resilience of urban populations and built environments to human-made disasters as well. It's including war, acts of terrorism, epidemics, and indeed the Canadian federal government's counterterrorism strategy is framed as a resilience-building effort. And if you look at the publications of the World Health Organization and other agencies in relation to recent large-scale epidemics, the word resilience is always there. The framing of the problem and the solution lies with resilience. Now, over time, the disaster preparedness lens has been expanded to encompass climate change adaptation. So ICLEI, for example, has expressly linked Hurricane Sandy, which devastated New York, the coast of New York and New Jersey, to climate change effects in its work on disaster preparedness. So we can think of climate change, which is, of course, a very long-term process, is really kind of a temporal elongation of the focus, the narrow focus on crises that the other shocks that I'm talking about are. So the focus really shifts from preparing for individual disasters to preparing for the effects of incremental long-term processes that may increase the frequency of disasters. So, you know, there's lots of research going on right now about the rising frequency of extreme weather events. Of course, the IPCC is talking about the incremental effects of global average temperature rise and its impact on water levels and so on. Related to all of this, environmental scientists, environmental economists, sociologists, and geographers have embarked on kind of theorizing and analyzing of the relationship between humanity and natural systems as a complex system in and of itself. So not treating the social world as distinct from the environmental world. So by viewing that as a complex adaptive system, they are interested in trying to come to some conclusions about how that system as a whole can be made more resilient. So we see research on ecosystem services, on urban metabolism studies, all kinds of things that probably political scientists normally think about, but there's a lot of work going out there. This is quite sophisticated work, but it's actually often quite abstract, and it's hard to tell how the rubber should hit the road in terms of policy making. Another thread in all of this is the notion of economic resilience. So the Brookings Institution's Metro Monitor program is an example of this, where they're looking at pre-financial crisis, pre-2008 economic indicators and looking at how quickly particular metropolitan areas have returned to lower levels of unemployment, economic output, and so on. So they've their analysis points to successful bounce back being correlated with all kinds of endogenous variables, things like education levels, the sectoral diversity of the economy, measures of social capital, labor market flexibility, and other factors. Okay, so we see focus on natural disasters, we see kind of focus on climate change adaptation out there, we see a focus on economic bounce back after recession, all of them framed in terms that relate to resilience. What kind of conclusions can we draw about this? Well, it seems to me that the equilibrium model, the kind of engineering model, is what dominates. While we have these more arcane studies of socio-nature studies and so on that look at complex systems, mostly the strategy has been to look at a particular variable and looking at whether it bounces back after a stress or a crisis. So while it creeps into discussions of climate change, this idea of transformative adaptation or bouncing forward is less visible. Second, there's some variation and perhaps confusion in what exactly is resilient when we're talking about urban resilience. So are we talking about the city as a social order, right? A matrix of overlapping and more or less organized communities that may engage in spontaneous self-help, right? So something beyond the state. Are we talking about the city as an economic network of production and consumption, right? That can be measured and compared at different points in time. Are we talking about the city as a built and natural environment, right? So the city occupies a natural space, but we talk about the built environment as the roads, the infrastructure, the buildings, and so on. Or are we quite narrowly talking about the city as a complex of local institutions of governance and administration that responds to stresses and impacts in particular ways? So all in all, it's hard to tell whether resilience has a specific meaning, right, that can be applied in all cases when applied to cities and urban policy, or whether it's simply being borrowed loosely as a kind of metaphor for a variety of only tenuously related phenomena. Okay, so through this project, I was grappling with how can we come up with a unified understanding of resilience that could actually be used by policymakers. The first conceptual move, it seems to me, is that we need to move beyond the kind of narrow equilibrium model and think more in terms of the city as a complex system. A city is definitely more akin to an ecosystem than it is to a piece of rebar. And that's something that is important to recognize. It's an agglomeration of people, of institutions, the organization of which is in constant flux. Populations are always changing, institutions are always changing. It occupies a built and natural environment that variously constrains and enables particular outcomes. There are multiple agents, there are multiple scales in play, there are multiple inputs to the system. So this is bewildering, right? But somehow we need to recognize something at the complexity of what we're dealing with when we're talking about the city. So I'm going to come back to the notion of complexity a little bit later. What I want to do now is talk about perhaps a model of how we can think about policymaking under complexity, or policymaking to foster resilience. The conceptual move that I want to put here is to think about policymaking in general as a form of risk management. So a risk management approach to policymaking addresses uncertainty by trying to build or encourage the development of systems that are compatible with a broad range of potential outcomes. So the infrastructure you create, the built environment you construct, the service delivery institutions that you establish, the funding models that provide them with resources, all of these should be designed to function sustainably and with minimal modification under various sets of circumstances that range from the acceptable to the unacceptable to the worst case. So this is in essence a probabilistic approach. Systems are designed to accommodate both best and worst case scenarios over short, medium, and long-term time horizons. And that means accepting and hedging against temporal uncertainty, the haze of the future, which obscures what is actually going to happen. Now, risk assessment is, of course, a common practice in many policy domains. They're usually in a univariate way. Like public health policy, for example, is expressly about mitigating the risk of disease through inspection regimes and vaccination programs, for example. Watershed management planning seeks to address or anticipate inevitable but temporally indeterminate events, things like the 100-year flood. They happen on average every 100 years, but you don't know when it's going to happen, right? So that's a risk management exercise. While it's certainly become politicized right now, EI contribution rates, right, are set to ensure the long-term solvency of the fund. So that too is a form of risk management. So let's contrast that approach with what might be called normative policymaking. So in some policy domains, maybe many policy domains, standard practice is to identify a preferred future outcome and then pursue actions to bring it about. So to this end, stakeholder consultations often take the form of visioning exercises. So this is in essence a deterministic approach. Leaders are pulled to move towards or achieve a singular objective rather than hedge against multiple possible outcomes. Now, the problem with deterministic policy domains like urban planning, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, is the tendency to put all the eggs in one basket. Right? If you're working towards a singular future, you're not hedging against things that might make that future not happen effectively. So you can end up with overbuilt infrastructure. You can end up with underbuilt infrastructure. You can end up with an uncompetitive economic base. You can end up with all kinds of social negatives. So there's countless case studies of normative visions and faulty predictions that have very long tails in the decades affecting cities. So how can policy making as risk management work in practice? Well, let's look at how risk management techniques are applied in other sectors. Financial managers are perhaps the most sophisticated practitioners of risk assessment. They seek to diversify portfolios of assets, right? That's what a mutual fund is. That's what an equity fund full of equities is. If the value of one part of a portfolio declines, a diversified portfolio contains other assets that will compensate for that over time, creating aggregate growth. So the challenge is to get the mix right and avoid betting too much on any one single component. That's what diversification is about. Now, infrastructure system planners mitigate risk by designing redundant conduits. So that if one wire or pipe or roadway is eliminated from the system, flows can travel through others instead. So redundancy is another component. Now, an example where we can find this perhaps most clearly is electricity system planning. Producing electricity by diverse means insulates against price shocks from changing commodity inputs. Right? If you have a system that's entirely based on burning natural gas becomes more expensive, so does electricity, right? If you have a whole range of different production, from hydroelectric to gas to wind to solar and so on, you're hedging yourself against variations in the cost of production of various types. It also insulates you against other kinds of risk. I mean, a wind farm only works when the wind is blowing, right? The solar production only works when the sun is shining, right? So by having a range of inputs that function at various times of day and different times of year, all of this can balance itself out. Having multiple redundant sources. So instead of having one giant gas plant, you have 15 small gas plants, means that if some of them break, the other ones can pick up the slack. And the same logic, the same redundancy logic also works for distribution, right? If you have, only one giant wire that travels from Niagara Falls to the GTA, and it goes down, you have a metropolitan area of 6 million people without power. You have multiple wires and multiple ways of bringing electricity into that system. So redundancy is a way as well to increase resilience. So if I can torture the eggs in the basket metaphor, a diverse and redundant system is resilient because all the eggs haven't been put into one basket, and you're not dependent on one type of egg, right? If one basket is dropped and the eggs break, you still have other baskets full of other eggs, right? If all the eggs from chickens are bad, you can always cook up the quail eggs, right? So you have a range of you have a system that is both diverse and redundant and therefore more resilient. Okay, so how do financial managers assemble their asset portfolios, and how do engineers design their infrastructure systems? Well, the way they do it is they test scenarios. This is different from forecasting, and this is different from projecting, right? Scenarios are constructed. They aren't necessarily the most likely things that happen, and they aren't necessarily flowing from past trends. Now, you can't test all possible scenarios, but what they test are a range of options that define kind of the space of what is likely to occur. So you test, probable acceptable scenarios, probable unacceptable scenarios, and probable worst case scenarios. And that guides the design of solutions that keep options open and maintain function under a wide range of circumstances. So this is exactly the kind of work that's being done flowing out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to try to imagine what kind of mitigation strategies will give you the best bang for buck, depending on different probable climate change effect scenarios, for example. There's also a growing academic interest in the UK and in the US, falling under the label of urban foresight studies and anticipatory governance studies. People are coming up with their own phrases and words right and left as they do. So there's a lot of interest in this idea of scenario testing as a way to guide public policy, as opposed to traditional notions of forecasting or projection. Now, these are powerful concepts, but we need to think carefully about how a risk management lens or model could be applied to other local government policy domains, including soft services. So I'll get to an example, but first I want to just clarify how we can think about risks in the urban concept and what kind of risks we're actually thinking, what kind of risks we should actually be thinking about. So we can think of infrastructure failure, we can think of epidemic, we can think of how a closure of a major employer can destabilize a local economy and as knock-on effects destabilize social service provision, public finance, and so on, civil unrest. We can think of big stuff, macroeconomic change, technological change, right? If you're a laggard in the adoption of new technologies, you may get left behind. We can think of the extreme weather and tectonic events that I've already discussed a little bit. If you're a local policymaker, you're on the receiving end of national and provincial policy changes as well that you have no control over. We can also think of demographic change, an aging society, right, being one powerful example. We can think of other kinds of economic and social change, the change in norms and ideas of what is acceptable in society. We can also think of how infrastructure ages gradually, and if we don't maintain it properly and plan for its replacement, eventually a crisis may occur. Climate change, resource depletion, especially of energy sources, the incremental accumulation of pollution, changes in human migration patterns. All of these things are inputs to urban systems, right? That can destabilize them in different ways, produce different outcomes. So how can we think of these types of changes? And we could come up with many more in a way that can help a policymaker gain traction on it. Well, to begin, I want to make a distinction between what I've called sudden shocks and slow shifts, right? There's a temporal dimension to it. Some things truly are quick hitting crises, right? The failure of a bridge, like occurred in Minneapolis a number of years ago. You know, a sudden appearance of an epidemic, like has occurred in California last year. You know, the closure of a major employer, like Heinz going away in Leamington and basically putting the town out of work, and so on. Also, these kinds of things, the earthquakes, the hurricanes. But, you know, as I've discussed a little bit earlier, there are, of course, very slow-moving transformations that occur. Things that don't hit us over the head, but have long-term cumulative effects, or build up slowly and then result in a sudden slippage or sudden event. So aging infrastructure ultimately leading to infrastructure failure, for example, or climate change, where, like the lobster in the pot, the heat slowly increasing, everything sort of feels fine, and it's still fine, and it's still fine, and it's still fine, and then suddenly, you know, when your kids are your age, the planet is uninhabitable. You know, these are slow shifts. Now, another distinction I want to overlay over that is what might be called internal or endogenous risks and external or exogenous risks. So if you're a local policymaker, an urban policymaker working for a local and regional government, or even at the provincial level, there's all kinds of things that you can't control. There's also all kinds of things that maybe you have a bit more leverage over. So distinguishing between these things can help you understand what you can grapple with and what you can't, and also to prioritize which items that you want to try to deal with. So this can help us understand which risks are the greatest by thinking systematically about it, figure out what you have control over, and also think about which interventions should be prioritized on the basis of risk and on the basis of control. So things like climate change, that's not something a municipal policymaker can control, right? You can make interventions that try to do your part to make your city less carbon intensive, but you're not going to bend the curve by yourself, right? You know, you can't control the myriad of factors that have led to an aging society, right? But you can think systematically about things in order to think about how you can anticipate their effects over time. All right. So what this kind of systemic analysis reveals is that complexity is the norm, that everything is to some degree related to everything else. So socio-demographic change has economic and environmental effects. Environmental change has social and economic effects. Economic change has social and environmental effects. If we pretend that these things stay within their own domains, we may experience all kinds of unintended consequences and surprises. All too often, we sit comfortably in our silos, right? And we bracket these kinds of cross-domain interdependencies and treat what are actually variables as parameters. So let's look at an example. This was really the focus of the project that the Ministry of Municipal Affairs was interested in funding, and that is the way that urban planning takes place. Now, traditionally, the planning of new and existing neighborhoods is market demand driven. The private sector isn't going to build housing unless there's immediate short-term demand for it, and it can be provided at a price that people are willing to pay. Usually the way this works is the expected population at full build out of a new suburb is forecast. On that basis, the number of dwellings is determined, and infrastructure is installed to support those dwellings. The physical format of development is largely dictated by engineering standards. There's sort of a pattern or a template the way that these things play out. And the temporal scope of it, even though there may be visioning around it that is long term, is really about what can be sold tomorrow when this stuff goes on the market. So absent from this discussion, whether it's regional or citywide or ward level or down to the neighborhood scale, is a real discussion about how neighborhoods may change over time, and how we need to anticipate the drivers of change. In fact, the physical environment of a neighborhood may be so locked down that it may not be able to adapt to long-term social, economic, and environmental change. So thinking about some of the variables that typically fall outside of conventional land use planning. We can think of demographic or economic or environmental variables. One that is of special interest to me, and is the subject of another paper that I'm working on right now, is about the long-term impacts of declining household size. The average household is half the size of what it was 50 years ago. What that translates into is depopulation of areas, right? With depopulation of areas, you have a shrinkage also less demand for services.